All right, welcome to another deep dive here. Today we're taking a look at a thinker, really. Someone whose name I think is pretty synonymous with a really huge shift in both philosophical and literary thought, Jacques Derrida. And for you, our listeners, especially the philosophy nerds out there, Derrida, who lived from 1930 to 2004, he probably needs no introduction.
Yeah, you're probably right.
I mean, this is the guy who developed deconstruction.
Yeah.
This critical approach that really, I think, went way beyond just looking at like academic texts and really challenged like the very foundation of like our political and social structures. I mean, this is someone whose impact you see across philosophy, literary theory, art, architecture, political science. I mean, he even achieved like, I don't know, almost like a celebrity status in the world of like intellectuals and academic.
It's true. And it's interesting because like deconstruction really did enter like the mainstream discourse, but at the same time, the core of his philosophical contribution, it still remains like a really intense subject, both of engagement and debate, within philosophy itself. And I think, given your background, you'll appreciate the depth of his dialogue with like the Western philosophical tradition.
Oh, absolutely. And that's precisely what this deep dive is about. We're going to really be focusing in on some key philosophical insights. What are the core arguments that Derrida makes? And we really want to think about, how can we understand his work if we're already, kind of familiar with some of the major concepts of philosophy. We don't need to get bogged down in the like super technical jargon, but we do want to appreciate just how deep and complex his thought really is. And, for you, our listeners, we know you're approaching this deep dive with a philosopher's eye, and we really want this to be, a rewarding and a stimulating exploration for you.
For sure.
So to get us started, where do we even begin to understand such a complex figure?
Well, to really grasp Derrida's project, you have to consider, the intellectual and the personal landscape that really shaped his early thinking. He was born in Algeria at the time, a French territory, into a Sephardic Jewish family. And this isn't just like some random biographical detail. Like the autobiographical thread runs really deep, deep through his work.
Yeah, and it's an important note here that Derrida himself actually like highlighted how his personal history really informed his philosophical inquiries. I'm thinking here specifically of his book Monolingualism of the Other, where he reflects on his experiences growing up under the Vichy regime.
Yeah.
And specifically, the restrictions on native languages that were imposed in Algeria, including Berber. And he actually describes this as like a really formative experience for him.
Yeah.
The anti-Jewish laws and, under the Vichy regime, they even interrupted his own education. And so it's clear that these early encounters with like the power of language and political exclusion, like they really had a lasting impact on how he thought about things like language, difference, and power, all of which become, very central to deconstruction later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we want to connect this to broader, philosophical themes, we can really see how these early experiences might have attuned him to questions of, marginalization, otherness, and really just the subtle ways in which like power operates through these like linguistic structures.
Right.
And I think, as we'll see, those become like really central concerns for deconstruction.
So after World War II, Derrida pursued philosophy in Paris, and after an initial setback, he gains admission to the École Normale Supérieure in 1952. And apparently, he had a funny encounter with Gilles Deleuze before his successful second attempt at the entrance exam.
Oh, really?
Deleuze actually offered him some words of encouragement. I mean, can you imagine the intellectual climate that Derrida was stepping into?
Oh my gosh. I mean, this is a period of just absolutely extraordinary intellectual energy in France. You've got figures like Deleuze, Foucault, Althusser, Lyotard, Barthes, Marin, all emerging at this time alongside, already established thinkers like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Lacan. It was a really amazing time. And phenomenology was like the dominant philosophical force at the time.
Right.
And so Derrida engages like really profoundly with Husserl's work. And this culminates in his master's thesis on Genesis in Husserl's philosophy, which was later published. And I think for a philosopher like yourself, really understanding this engagement is key to seeing how Derrida both built upon and then also departed from, like, the phenomenological tradition.
Yeah. And, it wasn't just Husserl that he was engaging with. He also was studying Hegel, and this was under Jean Hippolyte, which led him to develop this, like, Hegelian reading of Husserl, something that was, already being explored by Husserl's assistant, Eugen Fink. And while Derrida later on expresses reservations about Sartre and Merleau-Ponty's interpretations of Husserl, the extent of their influence on his thought is still debated by scholars.
Mm.
But one thing is clear, I think. His 1962 introduction to his French translation of Husserl's Origin of Geometry is widely regarded as like a seminal interpretation of that work. And it's particularly important, I think, because of its emphasis on the role of language in Husserl's understanding of historical constitution.
Yeah, and this move towards the significance of language, that's a really crucial step in Derrida's trajectory.
For sure.
This early and really intense focus on the intricate relationship between, like, consciousness, language, and history, I mean, that becomes just a persistent thread that runs throughout, his whole philosophical development.
Right.
And as with, like, any rigorous intellectual journey, there are these really significant points of, like, divergence and disagreement along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that play out, I guess, most notably in the 1960s, which is marked by this, like, really notable rupture with Foucault after Derrida's 1963 critique, Cogito and the History of Madness, where he challenges Foucault's interpretation of Descartes. And it said that their intellectual relationship never really fully recovered.
Really?
However, during the same period, Derrida was really deeply immersed in the works of Heidegger and Levinas. And his 1964 essay, Violence and Metaphysics, focusing on Levinas, that's considered like a pivotal early work for Derrida.
Yeah.
And especially for how it grapples with this concept of the other.
Yeah, and what's particularly interesting in that essay, I think, is the evident respect that Derrida had for Levinas's groundbreaking work on alterity, like the radical exteriority of the other. Yet at the same time, he maintains this, like, critical distance, and he raises these really crucial questions about the very language, right, that's used to articulate this otherness. But despite this intellectual tension, this back and forth, it actually fostered this lifelong friendship between the two thinkers.
And then, then came this remarkable year of 1967. We could call it Derrida's Annus Mirabilis. This is where he has the simultaneous publication of Writing and Difference, Voice and Phenomenon, and of Grammatology. And it's within these, like, groundbreaking texts that he introduces the term deconstruction, almost like, just kind of casually in passing, to try and articulate his philosophical project. And as the Stanford Encyclopedia entry notes, the term quickly gained, traction, especially in the Anglophone world. However, it also became kind of like this lightning rod for criticism, with some folks accusing his writing style of being deliberately obscure and lacking logical rigor.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point, I think, for a philosopher to consider, right? Like, Derrida's style, it often, intentionally deviates from, like, traditional argumentative prose, and he employs these rhetorical strategies and neologisms. But, the style, it was both, like, a key element of his project and also, a major source of contention.
Right.
It forced his readers to engage with philosophical questions in, like, a totally different way.
And he was certainly, like, very aware of this stylistic choice, and even mentions it explicitly in his 1980 speech when he receives his doctorate, where he talks about having consciously developed his writing style in the 1970s. And we see this really come out in works like Glass in 1974, which uses this highly unconventional two-column format. And in that book, he's juxtaposing his readings of Hegel and the writer Jean Genet.
Okay.
And then there's Postcard from Socrates to Freud and Beyond in 1980, which, famously begins with this, like, really long section of just epistolary fragments.
Wild.
Yeah, and so, while he later returned to a more, like, linear style of argumentation in some of his works, he never really fully abandoned this element of what he called evocation, which he linked to Heidegger's notion of a call that, he thought philosophy really should be heeding.
It's really interesting how his engagement with Heidegger, it deepened significantly in the late 1970s and 1980s. And this leads him to write a number of critical essays that are exploring, themes of sex and race in Heidegger's work, and culminating in his 1992 book, Aporius, which, delves into these fundamental paradoxes of existence.
Right.
And it's also interesting, that despite the, like, earlier critiques that he made of Husserl's interpretation in Voice and Phenomenon, he continues to engage with Husserl's thought throughout his career. We see this, especially in essays like Signature Event Context and his chapter on Husserl and Touching, Jean-Luc Nancy. And I think this, like, persistent return to these key figures really highlights this ongoing dialogue that's happening at the heart of his work.
And Signature Event Context, which was originally an address from 1971, is particularly relevant, I think, for our philosophy listeners, because it directly confronts J.L. Austin's speech act theory. Yeah, and Derrida draws this, like, really interesting connection between Husserl's bracketing of citations, from meaningfulness and phenomenological reduction,
Right.
and how Austin similarly excludes like these non-serious uses of language from the realm of performatives.
Interesting.
And this actually leads to a very well-known debate with John Searle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This was sparked by Searle's response to signature event context in the journal Glyph. And Derrida issues this really extensive, and I might even say sharp rejoinder called Limited Ink, which reveals, I think, his growing frustration with the reception of his work, especially, I think, within, analytic philosophy. And this tension probably, I think, reached its peak with the controversial honorary degree that he received from Cambridge University in 1992. And this actually prompted a public letter of objection from like this whole group of prominent analytic philosophers.
That's crazy. And despite these, sometimes really heated intellectual exchanges, Derrida maintained this like remarkably productive academic career.
Yeah, he did.
So he taught at the École Normale Supérieure throughout the 1960s. He became director of studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in 1983, a position he held until his death. And he also held a ton of visiting appointments at like really prestigious American universities, including Johns Hopkins, Yale, and UC Irvine.
Right.
And that's where his like extensive archives are now housed.
Wow.
He was also really active in the Groupe de Recherche sur l'Enseignement Philosophique, or about a GREPH, a research group that focuses on, philosophy pedagogy.
Okay.
And he co-founded the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris, serving as its first director from 1982 to 1984. And I think this commitment to these institutions of philosophical inquiry really just, underscores his like really deep engagement with the discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in the 1990s, there's this noticeable shift that occurs in his work with a growing focus on political and religious themes. And we really see this emerge in his 1989 essay, Force of Law, and then more fully developed in his 1993 book, Spectres of Marx, where he famously argues for the enduring relevance of, a deconstructed Marxism.
Right.
And he introduces this really influential concept of a democracy to come.
And, for political philosophers especially, this period of his work is super significant.
Yeah. And his later works, they continue to explore these like ethical and political dimensions. He delves into the complexities of hospitality in his work, A Word of Welcome on Levinus.
Right.
The concept of sovereignty and rogues.
Ugh.
And, this really challenging question of our relationship with animality in the animal that therefore I am, which was published posthumously. And even like his lectures on the death penalty and The Beast and the Sovereign. I mean, all of these works, they really illustrate this sustained engagement that Derrida had with these fundamental questions about, justice, power, and even like the very definition of human and non-human life.
Yeah. And sadly, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2002 and passed away in 2004. But, he left behind this vast and really influential body of work that, continues to be debated and explored by philosophers today.
So that, I think, gives us a really detailed overview of the intellectual journey and some of the key milestones in Derrida's life. But let's turn now to this concept of the incorruptibles. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions that Helene Cixous used this term to describe Derrida's generation of French philosophers. So from a philosophical perspective, what's the significance of this label?
Well, I think what's really revealing about this, especially for understanding like Derrida's own self-conception as a philosopher, is his interpretation of this ethos in like his last interview. And he describes this ethos as like an intransigent, even incorruptible ethos of writing and thinking. One that like resolutely resists any pressure to like oversimplify or to be intimidated by, like public opinion or the media.
Interesting.
And he emphasizes this like strict taste for refinement, paradox, and aporia. Like he's really defending its enduring importance for rigorous philosophical inquiry. And I think this really speaks to a certain kind of intellectual honesty and a real like resistance to easy answers.
And how does this commitment that he's talking about, how does it connect to his core philosophical project? So, the Stanford entry then goes on to introduce his 1998 essay, Typewriter Ribbon, where he articulates this central tension concerning the relationship between the singular event and the repeatable mechanism.
Right. And in that essay, Derrida identifies what he calls an apparent antinomy between the unique, the non-repeatable event, and this is something that he associates with, the living present,
right,
and the like predictable automatic repetition that's inherent in like a machine, which he links to, like the inorganic.
Okay.
And so the fundamental philosophical challenge for him, and I think also for his generation, was really to try and conceive of a relationship between these two, like, seemingly completely opposed realms
Right.
that would avoid both their complete separation and their reduction to, like, this homogeneous unity. Like, how can we understand singularity and iterability as being intrinsically linked without one simply negating the other?
So the task isn't to simply categorize these as like distinct separate things.
Right, exactly.
Or to just like merge them into one.
Right.
Instead, it sounds like he wants to understand this connection as something that's like internal yet fundamentally heterogeneous. Yeah. So this really sounds like we're getting to the heart of like his philosophical innovation. And it's here that we have this really pivotal concept of difference emerge.
Precisely. And difference, it's this term that Derrida famously coined.
Right.
And he deliberately spelled it with an A instead of an E.
Mm-hmm.
In French, the two are homophones.
Right.
But they're visually distinct.
Right.
And this term refers precisely to this intricate and like irreducible relation. And it signifies both like difference, the non-identity of things, right? And deferral, like the way in which meaning is always postponed or put off, like never fully present. And so for a philosopher, who's concerned with the nature of like meaning and being, difference offers this really like radical rethinking of presence and absence.
So now let's actually delve into like Derrida's basic argumentation and its implications for philosophical thought. The Stanford entry situates his work within like the lineage of transcendental idealism, following thinkers like Kant, Husserl, Heidegger, and it really focuses on these like necessary and foundational conditions of experience.
Yeah.
So how does Derrida both build upon and depart from this tradition?
Well, like his transcendental predecessors, Derrida's really concerned with the conditions that make experience possible.
Okay.
But his point of departure really lies in this like seemingly simple but ultimately revolutionary observation, and that is that all experience is fundamentally conditioned by time.
Okay.
Every experience occurs within this like fleeting moment of the present.
Right, but as Derrida shows us, this present moment isn't, the self-contained unified entity that traditional metaphysics often, assumes it is. It's intrinsically both a unique, unrepeatable event and also simultaneously connected to the repeatable past through memory and to the anticipated future. It's this inherent duality, this like at the same time aspect that becomes a cornerstone of Derrida's thought.
Yes.
So the present, it's never simply present to itself.
That's right. And what's so philosophically potent about this is that this like seemingly innocuous observation, it unravels all these deeply ingrained philosophical assumptions about, presence, identity, and origin. And from this temporal complexity of the present, Derrida derives like 4 really crucial and interconnected implications that I think really challenge like the very foundations of Western metaphysics.
Okay, let's hear it. So what's the first implication?
The first implication is that the present is never purely present. It's always already marked by what is absent.
Yeah.
The past that lingers as a trace.
Right.
And the future that is anticipated. And this introduces this like really crucial concept of the trace, which he describes as like this kind of proto-linguisticality or arch writing. So even the most like immediate experience for Derrida contains the possibility of repetition, of being inscribed or marked. And this possibility of repetition is really fundamental to the very structure of language and meaning. You can think of it as like the condition of possibility for any form of representation.
Okay, so what about the second implication?
The second implication is this like radical disturbance of the traditional linear structure of transcendental philosophy.
Okay.
So instead of viewing empirical events as simply like derivative from non-empirical foundational conditions, Derrida argues that they're inseparably like entangled.
Okay.
So the origin, traditionally conceived as like this pure self-identical, and prior to all else, that origin is always already divided.
Right.
It's marked by the trace. And he famously terms this the origin heterogeneous of spirit, emphasizing that the origin is never this like pure starting point, but it's always constituted by difference.
Okay, I think I'm following. So then what's the third implication?
Okay, so the third implication follows directly from this understanding of the like heterogeneous origin.
Okay.
And that is, nothing is ever given as such with like absolute unmediated certainty, because the origin is inherently divided. Everything that we encounter is always already like mediated. It's always bearing the trace of the other. And this actually makes the as, the very way in which we perceive and categorize things, that as becomes foundational.
Okay.
And it implies that there's no pure knowledge, truth, or perception that's untouched by this like inherent difference in iterability. And even, fundamental concepts like faith, perjury, language, all of these are implicated at the very origin of meaning.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to unpack.
It is.
But I think I'm following. So what about that fourth implication?
Okay, so the fourth implication relates to this, like inherent temporal and structural division. And it's the idea that every experience carries within it this like aspect of lateness,
Okay.
of being out of joint. And Derrida famously quotes Hamlet's poignant line here. He says, "The time is out of joint."
Yeah, I remember that.
And he later elaborates on this concept as anachronism, which is kind of like the temporal counterpart to spacing, or a spacement, as he calls it.
Right.
And crucially, he connects this like fundamental out of joint quality of time, not just to, like existential anxiety, but also to the very possibility of injustice and violence.
Right.
Because any attempt to impose like this pure unmediated presence, that's always going to do violence to like this inherent difference that he's talking about.
So this foundational argument, I mean, it might seem deceptively simple at first, but it really has like these far-reaching consequences for how we understand, the nature of being, meaning, and experience.
Yeah, it really does.
And, as the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out, it's really intimately connected to the philosophical problem of, autoaffection or self-affection. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how Derrida rethinks this concept?
Yeah, so autoaffection, in its most basic sense, is this idea of a self-relation where the subject, like, affecting and the subject affected are one and the same.
Yeah.
So think of, like, philosophical concepts like self-consciousness or Aristotle's notion of the unmoved mover
Right.
as, like, thought thinking itself, right?
Oh.
But Derrida argues that this seemingly self-contained self-relation, it already involves this, like, irreducible hetero-affection. So the I, in its very constitution, it implies this relationship with an other within itself. And he gives like several really compelling examples to illustrate this point.
So what would be the first example of this?
Okay, so a really incisive example is his critique of Husserl's principle of all principles in Voice and Phenomenon. And so there, Derrida examines Husserl's concept of hearing oneself speak as this like seemingly pure and immediate form of like auto-affection.
Okay.
So it's like a self-presence without any like external mediation.
Okay.
And what's philosophically crucial here is that Husserl saw this inner monologue, the experience of like hearing your own voice internally as this like privileged site of self-presence, like direct access to one's own consciousness without needing like external signs.
Right.
But Derrida meticulously analyzes like Husserl's own description of the living present with its inherent structure of retention, like the holding on to what has just passed, and pretension, the anticipation of what is to come, to reveal that there's this like necessary difference or this hiatus or spacing, within this like seemingly immediate self-relation. Even in this like silent monologue, there's this like minute temporal and structural division between like the instance of speaking and the instance of hearing.
Okay, yeah, I think I see what you mean.
And then he draws this like really powerful connection back to the trace and espacement through this analogy of like seeing yourself reflected in a mirror.
Okay.
So like there's this like necessary distance, this space, even though it's invisible,
Right.
that's absolutely crucial for the possibility of self-recognition.
Right.
So like we are both the seer and the seen, yet this duality inherently involves like a difference, this
Yeah.
non-coincidence with ourselves.
Right.
Like we can never be fully present to ourselves as this like pure unmediated unity.
Okay, so what would be like a second example of this?
The second illuminating example comes from Derrida's essay, How to Avoid Speaking. And here he engages with the traditions of like negative theology and the concept of denegation, which is this like really complex French term that encompasses both like denial and this kind of avowal through negation. And he explores this like inherent paradox of the secret. Like to truly possess a secret, you have to, in a sense, like tell it to yourself, which is this act of like auto-affection.
Right.
But in doing so, you create a trace, this like inscription that makes it potentially like shareable and thus undermines the very nature of like its absolute secrecy.
So like a truly private, uncommunicated secret, in Derrida's view, is almost like an impossibility.
I think so. I mean,
Yeah.
like, the very act of intending to keep it involves this, like, form of self-communication, right, that introduces the possibility of it being, like, disseminated. It always already compromises its, like, pure self-contained nature.
Okay, so then what would be like a third example of this?
Okay, so the third compelling example, I think, is drawn from his later work, Rogues, and specifically the essay The Reason of the Strongest, where he analyzes the intertwined concepts of, like, sovereignty and democracy.
Yeah.
And he argues that the very ideal of, like, pure sovereignty that seeks this, like, indivisible absolute power that's often associated with, like, silence and secrecy.
Right.
And those are, like, modes that really resemble, like, auto-affection, this, like, self-enclosed authority that doesn't have to, like, account to others.
Right.
But democracy, in contrast, fundamentally demands the sharing of power, the giving of reasons, the public articulation of, like, justifications. And these are all forms of heteroaffection, this, like, necessary engagement with the other.
And so he observes that these two principles, sovereignty and democracy, they're simultaneously like inseparable and in this constant tension.
Exactly.
Yeah, because the very act of exercising sovereign power, even in its attempt to like remain absolute and unaccountable, it inevitably requires, communication. It has to like issue laws or decrees or whatever.
Right.
And this ends up introducing this like division, and it ends up having to rely on an other.
Right, exactly. And conversely, even like the most inclusive democracy, at some point, it has to make decisions, it has to draw boundaries and exert a form of like collective power.
This inherent tension then leads us to this like further elaboration of Derrida's basic argumentation.
Yes.
And this is through these intertwined concepts of the worst, or le pire in French,
Yes.
and hospitality. And these two ideas, they might seem like kind of disparate,
Right.
but they're actually really deeply connected in his, later ethical and political thought.
Absolutely.
So Derrida frequently employs this like deconstructive framework to critically examine what he calls the worst.
Yes.
And he often approaches this concept through this ambiguous French phrase, plus d'un.
Right.
And this can mean, more than one, more of one, even no more one. And this really highlights like its inherent instability of meaning.
Yes.
And so he explains that like the worst really arises from a certain logic of singularity.
Yeah.
From this impulse towards like only one or the most one.
Yes.
And this kind of paradoxically can lead to like the most extreme forms of violence.
Absolutely.
Like the complete appropriation, subjugation, or even extermination of the other. Like it's this reduction of multiplicity to this like singular dominating entity. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry notes how this concept echoes Aristotle's idea of like a self-thinking, unmoved mover.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Derrida saw this tendency towards the worst as especially pertinent like in the contemporary global landscape, especially in this post-Cold War time of terror, as he calls it, and this era of like, increasing globalization where these traditional distinctions between like friend and enemy, they become increasingly blurred and destabilized.
For sure.
And so we had these new forms of violence that are often characterized by this like really disturbing autoimmune quality where the threat is perceived as originating from within one's own system. And this requires, the targeting and elimination of like internal others in this like desperate attempt to achieve this like paradoxical form of like self-preservation.
It's like this suicidal tendency in a way, almost.
Yeah, totally. So as like a philosophical and ethical counterpoint to this like pervasive threat of the worst, Derrida emphasizes this urgent need to move towards the least violence.
Right.
And he actually sees this like significant connection between this ethical imperative and what many folks have called this like return to the religious in the post-Cold War world.
Interesting. So how does he develop this connection?
Well, he delves into the etymology of the term religion, and he acknowledges